Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. The peasants are revolting. Yes, they certainly are revolting to look at. You know, somebody really ought to call Mayor Bass, let her know that Los Angeles is out of control these days. Oh, wait, but it's not Los Angeles, is it? Though you couldn't tell by looking. Seems like some of the locals down there in Tequilaville are taking exception to gentrification, but the gentrification apparently in their eyes doesn't come from the Blanco ruling class who actually run the place and are dominating them and slap them around like so many peasants. Instead, it's the gringos from up north that they're scared of and concerned about. Now, you know that mess had to come from their government, the same government that's actually been exploiting them and driving them out of their own country and telling them, you guys need to go anywhere other than here. They're not mad at their Blanco misleaders down there in Mexico. They're mad at the Blanco gringos in the United States. Go figure. Well, if this is their brilliant plan for how they're going to be stopping those gringos from coming in and buying up real estate, it's not a very smart plan. There's a number of Americans who go to Mexico for vacations, like Cancun, but there's also a lot of Americans who go for medical tourism. You had that case a few years back of those black tourists who went to northern Mexico to get some discount medications or whatever, and the cartels mistook them for Haitians. That's no joke, by the way. That's what happened. Apparently, they're down there beefing with the Haitians. They didn't know those people were actually foundational black Americans. That caused an international stink, but the cartels had the shooters turn themselves in, which is more than what happens with practically every other murder down there. So I guess in this case, this is what counts for justice. The lesson that they should have taken away from all of this illegal immigration is that if their people had stayed in Mexico and built up their country, then they would be too expensive for Americans to come in and try to buy it up. You don't see the Japanese complaining about Americans and foreigners coming in, buying up the land, and the same thing goes for Canada. You want to know why? They built those places up. They're too expensive for that. A handful of gringos show up in these people's neighborhoods and they're tearing up the whole city. Now, I wonder what would happen if millions of Americans came there every single year to stay. I wonder what their reaction to that would be. Not Americans coming to visit for a few days and then leave, but if millions of Americans were coming there every single year, and these Americans refused to learn the language. They demanded that English be spoken, that the government accommodate them, and that the culture needed to change for them. If Americans showed up and demanded that the 4th of July be celebrated and that they get government benefits and a ton of goodies and giveaways merely for being illegal aliens or just for being there, I wonder what their reaction would be to decades of that. But as I said before, don't kid yourself. This little display was set up by the Mexican government themselves. There's a number of American retirees who live in Mexico because it's less expensive and close to the U.S., and these kind of displays are meant to intimidate them. Now, because the gringo retirees down there are legally in the country and broke no laws, the Mexicans will have a hard time trying to find something to go after them about, especially because those people actually are putting something into the economy. They're not displacing workers there, and they're actually doing something other than taking from the economy. But then again, since when has law stopped the Mexican government from doing their dirt? It's not about prosperity for them. Of all of the groups from Europe who decided that they were going to do colonization, the Spanish by far were the most inept. Those guys never got their act together then or now. They couldn't run a colony any more than they could run their own country. And that same dysfunction also translated to the places that they colonized. A few folks from the U.S. are down there in Mexico buying some real estate. They came into the country legally. They're residing there legally, not committing any crimes. They're not bringing every one of their relatives and friends over to be sponsored to come in. And they're not lying and claiming that they're being persecuted in the U.S., though some of them might actually have a legitimate claim under the current regime. But you got a handful of what look to be paid vandals who are making sure to get in front of the cameras and cause a stink. That being the case, tourism is a crucial driver of Mexico's economy. I put economy in quotes. So if they're going to be running off all of the tourists or running off the people who come there from abroad, they're not going to have much left when it's all over. I guess they realize that all the little demonstrations in the United States, which by the way are also co-coordinated by the Mexican government, I guess they figured that those demonstrations didn't come to much, so now this is what's next. Threatening people from the United States if they decide to visit Mexico, even if only on vacation, never mind the fact that the people who live in Mexico don't want to live there. Speaking of vacations, the Orange Man has arranged for a number of illegals to get an all-expenses-paid trip to South Sudan. Because hey, who doesn't want to visit a war zone for the summer? This was clearly a hand-picked group for the photo. You can tell because it's all multiracial. It looks like one of those United Colors of Bennington ads from the 90s. But this is something the Brits tried to do. They couldn't make it work because Rwanda didn't want to be the dumping ground for illegals from Britain, and the British simply didn't have the money for all of those flights to Africa that they were threatening to do. But Trump's going to give it a go, or at least he's going to have a photo op making people think that he did. This is obviously a high-profile intimidation tactic, because even with all of ICE's raids for the cameras, they still haven't rounded up anywhere near the number of people that they would need to in order to make flights to Africa be feasible for the sake of repatriating or otherwise getting rid of massive numbers of people. Just keep in mind, the Orange Man has made certain exceptions to his policy, mostly for alleged farm workers. The problem with that is all of those farm workers came into the U.S. claiming asylum for persecution, and a lot of them, as soon as they get in, the first thing that they say is, now I want to bring over all of my folks from the home country. Trump would have to all but eliminate the asylum claim from being valid in the U.S., and he would have to eliminate all government programs for immigrants and yank federal funds from states that try to subsidize illegal aliens coming to the U.S. And of course, he would have to start prosecuting these unscrupulous landlords, these crooked businessmen, and these larcenous banks. That's something that he has yet to do. Because the landlords, the businessmen, and the banks, they should be considered no different than the illegal aliens themselves. They also need to be rounded up. The illegal aliens are coming to the U.S. because they know in advance that there's an entire infrastructure in place that will employ them, house them, and make it where they can send money back home, basically integrate them into the economy, which is what they came to the U.S. for. And there's a bunch of illegals who got green cards and immediately began sponsoring, quote-unquote, their relatives and everyone else to bring them over too. I told you about that last week, but these corrupt businesses are the entities who are fueling the flood of illegal aliens. Unless they begin getting rounded up and thrown in jail too, then ultimately what Trump's doing is hoping to scare the illegals away. And that may work in the short term. But without punishing these criminal enterprises who are openly working to encourage them to come to the U.S. and making big money off of supporting them, then people will wait a little while, and before it's all over, the old life will return. But in the meanwhile, it would be interesting to see if Trump gets around to expanding his flights to Africa for illegal aliens. And you got all of these illegal alien activists and the tethers who are concerned about this, and they want for black folks to be scared. You guys ought to be concerned too, because today it's us, tomorrow it's going to be you. Never mind the fact that these very people who are claiming that, when they came to the U.S., they were the main ones attacking black people. They come from anti-black racist cultures, or in the case of many African and Caribbean enclaves, they come from cultures who, because of their jealousy of what we've accomplished, they come here and they want to try to find a way to look down on us, because in their minds, they're like, well, we know you're looking down on us, so we got to look down on you. That's where that comes from. Jealousy, envy, just being off code as hell. But the people who are gnashing their teeth and who are now got their knees quaking because Trump has arranged for free flights for these illegal aliens to go to Africa, they might want to ask themselves, what was it that they were doing all of this time that made it where black Americans have been saying, you know what, y'all got this. Everybody wants to try to guilt trip us into something, but nobody ever wants to look at their own behavior. What's happened is Donald Trump made it very clear that any of these people who thought to themselves that they were going to otherwise be shouting him down, that's not going to be allowed. And even some of their little political buddies, they're getting arrested as well. And now what these guys are doing is they're saying we're not really sure where to turn. That's deliberate. What Trump and Stephen Miller are doing is a basic part of war. They're demoralizing the enemy. There's no threat that there will ever be any retaliation from these people, or even long-lasting hurt feelings for that matter, because they know that they're in the wrong, and worse, they're utterly dependent on the U.S. economically. And of course, you got these people who come from Latin America, who as far as they're concerned, they identify as white on their driver's licenses, and on their job applications, and their school forms and census forms. And that being the case, whether they're prepared to admit it or not, they're still holding out a candle that they're going to be classified as white at some time in the future. For a lot of them, they just figured that if they live it long enough, apparently they're going to be able to manifest it. Well, the only manifest that they've got is a flight manifest to South Sudan. And that's the reason why we're seeing people nutting up left, right, and center. The Mexican government and their handful of hooligan crisis actors can be mad all they want, but the problem with a failed state is that they fail to make themselves capable of retaliating. And don't give me any crap about BRICS. With countries like Mexico, all they can do is be vassal states of stronger countries that are not failures, like China. That's how that one's going to shake out. You look at Mexico's history, and that's what they've always been. A tool of others. Even during both world wars, spoiler, Mexico was allied with America's enemies in both world wars. But then again, how much good did Mexico do for their Axis allies in either war? See, the problem for the people from Latin America is they thought that they were going to be building a road to the future, paving that road to the future over black people's dead bodies is what they thought was going to happen. They were thinking to themselves that they were going to have it both ways, that they could go ahead and claim to be quote-unquote people of color for the sake of taking advantage of what it is that black people have put in place, but by the same token, they also were going to be classifying themselves simultaneously as being white. And now some of them are starting to realize, however slowly, that that road that they thought that they were paving, well, the white supremacists have made up their minds that it's going to be a one-way street. Virtually all of the immigrants who came to the United States came as opportunists. But there are no bigger opportunists in world history than these white supremacists, and that's who these folks chose to handcuff themselves to. So they're just going to have to get used to taking the abuse. It's not like they can do much about it except for vent and rage in the streets, and these good white blancos up north, they're used to that. Just like their president making empty threats about mobilizing, well, I guess we see what the mobilization is. A handful of hooligans in the streets. That's not going to change the calculus on anything. But if the Mexicans want to keep this up, go right ahead. They already have few people who want to go there, and they'll scare off what few folks might have been adventurous enough to come. And as for the idea that they're somehow going to be retaliating against the United States, that they're going to be driving out the gentrifiers, I consider the irony to be absolutely excruciating. Well, since there's probably going to be a lot more blancos coming down south and taking up more of the real estate, if the Mexicans want some pointers on what they should do, here's a suggestion. Learn to speak English. I recommend that they start by learning the phrase, no trespassing. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Amir Miller, Richard Lovell, Suleiman Alaji, Janitha Blue, and Jesse Gibson. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.